I wasn't looking for death records when I started this investigation. I was researching something far more mundane: census discrepancies in the 1870s, demographic shifts that conventional historians attribute to immigration patterns and westward expansion, standard population history, the kind of thing you expect to find neat explanations for in published papers and academic journals. But then I found the vital statistics ledgers from 1876, and everything I thought I understood about 19th century record keeping collapsed. 4 million deaths, all in a single year, all classified under the same designation in official government records: unknown origin. Not plague victims, not cholera outbreaks, not yellow fever epidemics that ravaged cities with documented medical consensus, not typhoid, not smallpox, not any of the usual suspects that filled death registers from that era. Unknown origin, as if 4 million people simply stopped existing, and the clerks processing their deaths couldn't determine why. Or wouldn't, or were instructed not to. The records are real. They exist in state archives, in federal repositories, in vital statistics bureaus across multiple jurisdictions. You can request them. You can hold the ledgers in your hands. The ink is faded but legible. The handwriting is consistent with period documentation. These aren't forgeries or fabrications. They're official government records, processed through the standard bureaucratic channels of their time, signed by registrars whose names appear in other authenticated documents from the same offices. The paper trail is ironclad. What's impossible to explain is what the records actually say. Let me be specific about what I found. The vital statistics ledgers from 1876 show a mortality spike that defies every conventional explanation. In Pennsylvania alone, 387,000 deaths, classified as unknown origin. In New York, 412,000. Ohio, 298,000. The pattern repeats across state after state. Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, all showing mortality figures that dwarf their total recorded populations. For that year, according to the same census data these vital statistics bureaus were supposed to be coordinating with. The coordination problem emerges immediately. These weren't independent clerical errors. The classification appears simultaneously across jurisdictions that supposedly operated autonomously. Ask yourself how that happens. How do vital statistics bureaus in Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, and a dozen other states all adopt the same unusual classification for deaths they can't or won't explain, all in the same year, all processing numbers that exceed their documented populations? The standard explanation, the one you'll find if you even find historians willing to discuss this at all, is record-keeping confusion, duplicate entries, clerical mistakes compounded across poorly coordinated offices. But that explanation collapses the moment you examine the records themselves. Because the unknown origin classifications appear in ledgers that otherwise demonstrate meticulous attention to detail. The same clerks who supposedly made catastrophic counting errors in 1876 processed deaths before and after that year with standard accuracy. Causes of death are listed with medical precision: tuberculosis, pneumonia, complications of childbirth, industrial accidents, each with attending physician signatures, each with dates and locations that cross-reference with other official documents. The record-keeping system was sophisticated, coordinated, and reliable. Except for this one classification, appearing in this one year, applied to numbers that make no demographic sense. Let me show you what the vital statistics infrastructure actually looked like in the 1870s, because understanding the system makes the anomaly more disturbing, not less. Vital statistics bureaus weren't haphazard operations run by untrained clerks in isolated offices. They were part of a coordinated federal system established in the 1850s and 60s, modeled on European registration systems that had been operating for decades. The American Public Health Association published standardized forms in 1874. The Census Bureau coordinated with state offices to ensure population data aligned with birth and death registrations. Physicians were required by law in most states to file death certificates within specific timeframes. There were penalties for non-compliance. The infrastructure existed to track mortality with precision, and that infrastructure produced these records. Death certificates processed through the standard channels, registrars who signed their names to documents that said, in effect, we have 4 million bodies and we're classifying the cause of death as unknown origin. Not unknown in the sense of medically ambiguous, which would use terms like general debility or natural causes or failure to thrive, all of which appear in period documents for deaths where specific pathology couldn't be determined. Unknown origin is different. It suggests the deaths themselves are of uncertain provenance, as if the deceased came from somewhere the record keepers couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. The geographic distribution poses its own impossible questions. The deaths cluster in specific regions, but span the continent. Heavy concentrations in the northeast and midwest, moderate numbers in the south, scattered occurrences in territories that weren't even states yet, all in the same year, all processed through vital statistics systems that required coordination between local physicians, county registrars, state bureaus, and federal census operations. The logistics alone are staggering. To classify 4 million deaths identically across that geographic spread requires communication infrastructure, standardized terminology, and coordinated decision-making on a scale that supposedly didn't exist. But the streetcars were just the surface infrastructure, if you'll allow me a moment of transition. Because the vital statistics system didn't operate in isolation. It required supporting infrastructure that poses even more troubling questions. The census operations, for instance. The 1870 census recorded the baseline population these death figures are measured against. The 1880 census showed numbers that, according to official explanations, reflect immigration and natural population growth despite the mortality spike in between. The coordination required to produce census data that obscures a loss of 4 million people is extraordinary. Who coordinated the counting? Who decided which populations to include and exclude? And how do you synchronize that decision across the hundreds of census enumerators working in the field? This is where conventional demographic historians stop listening, because the implications are uncomfortable. If the vital statistics records are accurate, if 4 million deaths actually occurred and were processed through official channels, then the census data has to be systematically adjusted to hide the population loss. If the census data is accurate, then the vital statistics records represent something other than deaths in the conventional sense. Either way, you're looking at coordinated manipulation of official records on a massive scale, or you're looking at deaths that came from populations the government chose not to acknowledge in census counts. The death registration system itself reveals even more perplexing details. To understand what unknown origin actually meant in the bureaucratic language of 1870s vital statistics, you need to examine how deaths were categorized. The standard classification system included dozens of specific causes, infectious diseases broken down by type, accidents categorized by circumstance, violent deaths with legal determinations, maternal mortality with obstetric details, infant deaths with age specifications. The system was designed to track public health trends. Unknown origin doesn't fit anywhere in that framework. It's not a cause of death. It's a designation that questions the origin of the deceased themselves. And here's what truly disturbs me about this investigation. The records include names, not all of them, not consistently, but enough to establish that these weren't statistical abstractions. These were individuals with documented identities, birth dates that, when you trace them back, don't appear in the corresponding birth registries, marriage certificates that list spouses who also appear in the unknown origin death records, property deeds signed by people whose births were never officially recorded, but whose deaths were meticulously documented and classify as originating from somewhere the bureaucracy couldn't specify. Ask yourself what that suggests. Because the pattern repeats with unsettling precision, entire family units appearing in death records with unknown origin classifications, no corresponding birth records, property holdings that transfer to next of kin who also lack birth documentation but eventually appear in death ledgers with the same classification. It's as if a parallel population existed alongside the documented citizenry, visible to the administrative state only in the moment of their deaths, originating from somewhere the official record refused to name. If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider subscribing. This kind of research takes hundreds of hours in archives most historians never examine, cross-referencing ledgers that were never meant to be connected, asking questions conventional demographic history refuses to address. Your support makes it possible to continue this work. The census operations reveal the coordination problem in its starkest form. The United States Census Bureau in the 1870s employed approximately 7,000 enumerators to count the population. Each enumerator covered a designated district, recording every household, every individual, every demographic detail, recording by federal law. The 1870 census showed a total U.S. governable population of approximately 38.5 million. The 1880 census showed 50.2 million. The official explanation for the growth: immigration and natural increase, but the vital statistics records from the intervening decade show mortality figures that make that arithmetic impossible. 4 million deaths in 1876 alone, classified as unknown origin, standard mortality from documented causes, disease, accident, violence, adding several million more across the decade. Immigration records for the 1870s, maintained by separate federal offices, show approximately 2.8 million arrivals. Birth registrations, incomplete because not all states required them yet, suggest natural increase of perhaps 6 million across the decade. The numbers don't reconcile. You can't get from 38.5 million in 1870 to 50.2 million in 1880 when you account for the documented losses and documented gains. Unless the unknown origin deaths came from populations that weren't counted in the census to begin with. The coordination required to maintain that discrepancy is staggering. Census enumerators would have had to systematically skip households, entire communities, populations living in documented structures with property tax records, but no census presence, or the unknown origin deaths represented something else entirely, some category of mortality that vital statistics bureaus were required to record, but census operations were instructed to ignore. Either way, you're looking at federal agencies operating with contradictory mandates, processing incompatible data, and maintaining the contradictions for decades. Let me take you inside what it would have meant to be a vital statistics clerk in 1876, because the human dimension of this makes the bureaucratic anomaly more comprehensible. Imagine sitting at a desk in a county registrar's office, processing death certificates that arrive from physicians, undertakers, family members filing the paperwork required by law. The forms are standardized: name of deceased, age, date of death, cause of death, attending physician if applicable, place of burial. You've processed thousands of these documents. You know the patterns: seasonal variations in mortality, diseases that cluster in specific months, accidents that reflect the rhythms of agricultural or industrial work. Then the certificates start arriving with a different pattern. Deaths you're instructed to classify as unknown origin, not because the physicians can't determine cause of death. The medical details are often included in the notes, but because of something else about the deceased, instructions from the State Bureau perhaps, or federal guidelines you're not privy to the reasoning behind. You're told to use this classification for specific cases, and the cases share characteristics that aren't medical. Family names that don't appear in previous records, addresses in neighborhoods you thought you knew, but that aren't reflected in the census enumeration you helped with 4 years ago. You process the documents because that's your job. You don't ask questions because questioning bureaucratic procedures isn't how the system works. And the certificates keep coming. Not a handful, not an unusual cluster you might notice and inquire about, but thousands across the year. Enough that unknown origin becomes a standard category in your ledger. a classification you mark without thinking about the implications, because the implications are too large to fit inside the scope of your desk, your office, your understanding of what vital statistics are supposed to record. The international dimension makes the coordination problem even more impossible to dismiss, because the unknown origin classifications aren't limited to United States records. Similar designations appear in vital statistics from Canada, specifically the provinces that bordered areas of heavy concentration in the US. Australia shows a mortality spike in 1876 with unusual classifications that translate roughly as origin undetermined. European archives, when you can access them, show parallel anomalies, not identical. The bureaucratic language varies by nation and record-keeping tradition, but the pattern is there. Excess mortality in the same year, classified in ways that question the origin of the deceased rather than the medical cause of death. Who coordinated this? What communication infrastructure existed in the 1870s to ensure that vital statistics bureaus across multiple nations adopted similar approaches to the same category of deaths? Telegraph systems existed, certainly, and steamship routes connected continents. But the level of bureaucratic coordination this represents, the synchronized adoption of unusual classifications across autonomous government offices, suggests planning and communication that goes beyond what we acknowledge as available technology and administrative capacity for that era. The silence in the historical record is deafening. Demographic historians don't discuss the 1876 mortality spike. Public health histories skip from the cholera epidemics of the 1860s to the modernization of sanitation systems in the 1880s without accounting for the intervening vital statistics anomalies. Census Bureau publications acknowledge discrepancies between enumeration data and vital statistics, but attribute them to incomplete record keeping, a convenient explanation that collapses when you examine the specific records involved. The unknown origin classifications aren't examples of incomplete data. They're examples of extremely complete data that raises questions the official narrative can't accommodate. And then there are the cemetery records. This is where the physical evidence becomes impossible to dismiss, because 4 million deaths require burial or cremation, and those dispositions leave traces. Cemetery plot maps, burial registries maintained by churches and municipal authorities, undertaker ledgers that document who was interred where and when. When you cross-reference the vital statistics unknown origin deaths with cemetery records from the same year, the pattern that emerges is deeply strange. Sections of cemeteries showing intensive use in 1876, plots filled in concentrated bursts, often in areas designated for paupers or unclaimed dead, but sometimes in sections with purchased plots, and headstones showing family names that don't appear in other official records. The undertaker ledgers list services performed, bodies prepared for burial, but the deceased's information often matches the unknown origin classifications. No listed next of kin, no birth record on file, addresses that can't be verified in city directories or property tax rolls. The infrastructure of death processing functioning normally, documenting its work with bureaucratic precision, handling bodies that came from somewhere the official record refused to specify. The headstones themselves, when they exist, pose their own questions. Many are simple markers, names and dates without the genealogical details that characterized period grave monuments, but some show more elaborate information. Family groupings suggesting these weren't isolated individuals, but entire households. Epitaphs in languages that don't match the linguistic demographics of the surrounding area. Dates that, when you trace them across multiple cemeteries, show synchronized mortality events, dozens or hundreds of burials in the same week across distant locations, all classified as unknown origin in the corresponding vital statistics. Ask yourself what infrastructure made this possible, because coordinating burials across that geographic scale requires communication networks, transportation systems to move bodies or mourners, administrative capacity to process the legal and medical documentation involved. The 1870s had all of that infrastructure. Railroads connected cities across the continent. Telegraph lines ran alongside the tracks. Undertaking had professionalized into an industry with standardized practices and record-keeping requirements. The system existed to handle mass mortality events. What's unexplained is why that system was activated for deaths the government chose to classify as unknown origin, rather than attributing to any of the medical or circumstantial causes that filled the rest of the vital statistics ledgers. The property records reveal another dimension of the coordination problem. When people die, their property transfers according to legal procedures. Estates are probated, deeds are transferred. Tax assessments are updated to reflect new ownership. The probate courts in 1876 processed an unusual volume of cases. Estates where the deceased held substantial property, but whose origins couldn't be traced through the normal genealogical pathways. Birth records absent, marriage certificates, listing spouses, who also lack documentation of origin, wills that distributed property to heirs whose relationship to the deceased couldn't be verified through conventional family records. The legal system processed these cases anyway. Probate judges signed off on transfers, attorneys filed the paperwork, clerks recorded the transactions in official ledgers. The property was real. The ownership was documented through deeds and tax records. But the people who held that property came from somewhere the administrative state couldn't or wouldn't specify. And when they died, their property transferred to next of kin who shared the same documentation gaps. The legal infrastructure functioned, processing extraordinary situations as if they were routine, maintaining the official fictions required to make the system work. This brings us to the central question this investigation cannot escape. What happened to the knowledge? Not just the knowledge of who these people were and where they came from, though that's certainly part of it, but the knowledge that this happened at all. 4 million deaths in a single year, processed through official channels, documented in government records that still exist in archives, requiring coordination across multiple levels of bureaucracy and multiple nations. How does that disappear from historical consciousness? The rhythm of forgetting has its own momentum. Once begun, it accelerates. The clerks who processed the unknown origin certificates retired or died, taking their direct knowledge with them. The next generation of vital statistics workers inherited the ledgers but not the context, the unspoken understandings that made the classifications make sense to their predecessors. The administrative state moved on to other concerns. The Census Bureau focused on documenting immigration waves and westward expansion, narratives that supported the official story of American growth and progress. Public health historians emphasized the victories over infectious disease, the modernization of sanitation, the professionalization of medicine. The 1876 mortality spike didn't fit any of those narratives, so it was simply not discussed. Academic historians who encounter the records in archives face a choice: acknowledge the anomaly and open themselves to accusations of promoting conspiracy theories, or note the discrepancy in a footnote and move on to topics with more conventional explanations. The institutional incentives all push toward the latter. Peer review processes, publication standards, career advancement in historical departments. All of it depends on staying within the boundaries of accepted interpretation. The unknown origin deaths are too far outside those boundaries to discuss seriously without professional consequences. Within a generation, the memory faded sufficiently that we could pretend it never happened. The records remained, filed in archives that most researchers never access, cross-referenced in ways that make the full scope invisible, unless you're specifically looking for connections across multiple ledger types. Birth records in one archive, death records in another, census data in a third, property records in county courthouses scattered across the country. The coordination required to see the pattern is almost as elaborate as the coordination required to create it in the first place. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the forgetting wasn't passive institutional neglect, but something more systematic, not a conspiracy in the sense of secret meetings and coordinated cover-ups, but a collective decision to look away to prioritize narratives that supported national identity over evidence that complicated those stories. The official history of the 1870s emphasizes Reconstruction, westward expansion, industrial growth, the transformation of America into a modern nation. 4 million deaths classified as unknown origin doesn't fit that story. So the deaths were documented, processed through proper channels, recorded in official ledgers, and then systematically ignored by everyone whose job it was to interpret what the historical record means. What becomes possible if we acknowledge what the records actually say? If we accept that 4 million people died in 1876, that their deaths were real enough to require burial and legal processing, that the bureaucratic state documented their passing even while refusing to specify their origins, it means populations existed that our official histories don't account for. Communities large enough to leave massive traces in vital statistics and cemetery records, but invisible to census enumeration. People who owned property, paid taxes, interacted with legal and medical systems, and left descendants who inherited their documentation gaps. The buildings remember, even if we've chosen to forget. The cemeteries hold the bodies. The archives preserve the ledgers. The property records show the transfers. The evidence is physical and persistent, and impossible to dismiss once you've seen the scope of it. The question isn't whether this happened. The documentation is overwhelming and official, and processed through channels designed to ensure accuracy. The question is why we've been so determined not to see it, why acknowledging sophisticated population movements in the 1870s threatens our understanding of demographic history, why the official narrative requires us to pretend that 4 million documented deaths classified as unknown origin are clerical errors rather than evidence of something we don't have frameworks to explain. Ask yourself why. Why would vital statistics bureaus across multiple states and nations adopt the same unusual classification in the same year? Why would census operations systematically exclude populations that left enormous traces in other official records? Why would the historical profession, which prides itself on following evidence wherever it leads, refuse to discuss anomalies this large and this well documented? What are we protecting by maintaining the official narrative that dismisses or ignores what the records plainly say? The pattern becomes undeniable once you've examined enough ledgers, cross-referenced enough sources, traced enough individuals through the fragmentary records they left behind. These weren't statistical artifacts or clerical mistakes. These were people whose origins the administrative state chose to classify as unknown, even while documenting their deaths with bureaucratic precision. The infrastructure existed to track them in death, if not in life. The coordination existed to apply the same classifications across vast geographic and jurisdictional distances, and the forgetting, when it came, was thorough enough that we can now encounter the records without immediately recognizing what they represent. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The vital statistics ledgers sitting in state archives, available for anyone to request. The cemetery sections filled in concentrated bursts in 1876, the probate cases, processing estates for people whose origins couldn't be traced, the census data that doesn't reconcile with the mortality records, the coordination problem that makes conventional explanations impossible, the silence in the historical record that persists despite overwhelming documentation. The evidence accumulates. The pattern repeats across sources that should corroborate but instead reveal deeper impossibilities. And the only question remaining is whether we're willing to look at what the official records actually say, or whether we'll continue to protect narratives that require us to ignore 4 million documented deaths, because acknowledging them threatens too much of what we think we know about demographic history, state record keeping, and the populations that existed in the 19th century but that our official histories have chosen to forget.